So here's how the van looked at the start. It was in very good condition with those white panels protecting the metal, but it did mean that there was an obscene amount of screws to take out. So I got to work removing them all, and I also took out the floor and the bulkhead, which left me with the blank canvas to begin this project. I started the actual build with some sound deadener. Some people think this is unnecessary weight, but being my third van conversion and having experience both with and without, I decided to go with it again. It really does make a difference, especially if you're not having a bulkhead in your layout. So I got this from Dodo Dead Mat, and it comes in pre-cut rectangles, which makes it easy and quick to apply. You just peel the paper off and stick it down, and then I just used a paint roller tool with a sock on it to help smooth it out. I tried to make sure that each panel had at least 30 and more like 50% coverage, although I do think I went a bit overboard with this, and I just left the areas where I was going to be having windows and roof vents later. Next I cut 12mm battens and secured them to the metal floor with some Sikaflex adhesive after filling and treating all the screw holes from the original flooring. My layout is going to be quite open plan, so I wanted the extra stability by using the battens to give the flooring more points to screw into. I then filled the spaces with Dodo Thermo Liner, which matched the 12mm battens and was far easier to work with than the PRI insulation boards that I've used previously. Oh, and the only reason that I'm using 12mm is because I'm quite tall and I'm trying to maximise the amount of headroom I'll have. And since the original flooring was in decent condition and is marine ply, I decided to reuse it. Okay, so the floor is now done. Finally, we're back at where we started pretty much, but let's crack on and insulate the walls. For the walls and the ceiling I used a combination of insulation. This Dodo fleece made from recycled bottles for all the channels and tight spaces, making sure that it wasn't too compacted since it needs the air to be effective. And then for the wall panels I first used the thermo liner, the same as the floor, which I really liked because you can just cut it with some scissors, and then once you've got the right shape you just peel off the backing and stick it down. This is only the first layer of insulation though, I added a second step later on. And then it was time to start battening the walls, for which I use Sikaflex and self-tapping screws. These battens are only 18mm, but you'll see why in a bit. And the screws just love to get involved with the fleece behind, so just use a screwdriver to hold it out of the way while you're screwing it in, or put the battens on before you do the recycled bottle stuffing. So for the upper areas I used 32mm thick pieces because this meant that there will be a flush level when adding the upper cabinets. There's some parts sticking out which you can see, and it just basically creates one flush line that you can easily attach the cabinets to. I then finished off insulating the channels and found this method of feeding a wire through, attaching the insulation and pulling it back to be the best for the ceiling parts because the holes are just too small to get your fingers in. Once that was all done, it was time for the second stage of insulation, which was spraying the thermo fleeces on top of the liner. I added this batten to the back to give the ceiling something to screw onto later, and I realised I didn't have enough space for 2 roof vents, so I finished off that area and then the rest of the panels too. It was then time to start the second stage of my wall battening. And this time I'm using 12mm strips of ply because they will conform to the curve of the van. And I also added some pocket screw holes to the ends of each batten. And this is a tool I use a lot during the build, which I highly recommend you picking up a decent one, as once you use it, you'll want to use it for everything. So I started securing the upright battens, but it's quite dark in there, so let's add some windows before continuing. So I'm not going to lie, this was probably the most daunting part of the build for me, but luckily my mate Sam offered to give me a hand, as I was pretty useless. But I still had the all-important job of safety inspector. Just check out that ladder support. Honestly though, if you have someone who's done it before, it's really not too bad. These vans have a line that you follow on the inside, so Sam drilled the corners and then we drew the lines on the outside so that there was a guide to follow. Just make sure that you use some tape to protect the metal from the jigsaw base and take your time with it. Give yourself a full day dedicated just to doing the windows, because I promise you it's going to take longer than you think. And of course, pick a nice day and hope it doesn't rain. When you mount the window to the bonding, make sure you apply some pressure as I just push down the whole way around just to make sure it's got a good squashed connection. And add some tape to the top, like we did here, just to prevent it from sliding down as it sets. So with the confidence from the back windows, we then tackled the big window on the sliding door using the same process. And this is when I considered maybe having a food truck instead of a camper van. So the process is this: after cutting, file down the edges, wipe away the metal shavings, add the primer, add edging to the opening, and then the bonding, then stick the window down and hope you've done a good enough job so that it won't leak. Okay, now back to the wall. So I attached these upright battens for two reasons. I like to use 4mm ply for my walls, just because it can bend a lot nicer to the curve of the van, but also it bends over the bulges like in the middle there a lot easier if you're using thin ply. And secondly, it just gives you a lot more mounting points when you attach the wall to the battens, just making it a lot more sturdier. And those pocket holes I added earlier are just so that I can attach these battens to that top block piece, just giving it a bit more strength when I eventually mount the upper cabinet, even though most of the strength of that will be on the blocks themselves. And then I finished off the battening with the ceiling by using Sikaflex and self-drilling screws again. Next, it was time to move on to the final big hole, the roof vent. This is my third time doing this, and I've never had a leak before, so I stuck with the same method. I drilled the corners with a large enough drill bit so that the jigsaw blade would fit, and then taped a sheet of plastic underneath to catch the metal shavings, preventing them from entering the inside. You can see here just how flimsy the roofs are on these vans, which is why it's important to make that wooden frame that the fan will screw into, and if you do this first, you can use it as a guide, like I did. So I used mastic tape, as it's worked so well on the other builds. I basically cut each strip to size and then used a knife to mesh the joins together, and then repeat for a second layer. And then the adhesive on the wooden frame is just to stick it to the ceiling while it's being screwed into, and I also used some clamps to hold it in place. Now these Max Air fans are really easy to install since the base of the fan is separate and gets screwed into the wooden frame without a lid getting in the way. I then removed the excess mastic tape to give it a clean surface to Sikaflex the edges, doubling up on the waterproofness, and the Max Air instructions recommend to add some Sikaflex onto the screws as well. And then to finish the job, you just slot the fan in place and attach it with these 4 screws. So the solar panels were the easiest I've done yet. The boxers, relays and Deccatos, and the Ram Pro Masters for the Americans have these mushroom heads installed on the roofs for roof racks. So I just bought these brackets designed for them and then used slotted channel unistrut as my roof bars. And they're spaced 1.5 meters apart, so I found some solar panels that were 1.5 meters long and then attached them with bolts and nylock nuts. and trust me, they are not going anywhere. And when that was done, I was able to finish the ceiling insulation. So I doubled up on the 12mm thermoliner, which brought the insulation to 24mm and close to the depth of those wooden battens. I finished off attaching the battens together and added these end pieces for the edge of the walls to have something to be screwed into. I also ran all my wiring at this stage to the appropriate places, utilising the space underneath the overcap shelf and then feeding it through some conduit to get to where it needed to go. Okay, so now the fun part can begin. I have really always disliked the preparation stages as the progress just seems so slow, but from this point I find the transformation happens a lot quicker. For the ceiling I used 4mm plywood and I used a full sheet widthwise and then just trimmed it down to where one of the battens on the ceiling were. And I placed this sheet in the middle since the edges would be covered by upper cabinets, but I added slats later on, so it didn't really matter too much about where the join lines were anyway, but I do think it means there's less ply wasted. I then worked on the walls, so I measured the full length I could use and then cut the ply to size, and then I used this offcut to template the curve in the corner. I repeated the process for the other side, but this one had more cuts to make to fit the shape of the wall since it's a lot shorter. And then for the door shape, I just removed the trim and traced the van shape, but then measured the depth of that so I could subtract it on the ply before making the cut so it's not all the way to the edge. But if you're wondering about that cutout section in the corner, it's because of that metal bulge. So no amount of flex in the ply would conform to that. So instead I'm having a shelf with a slanted wall instead, which is also going to continue to above the door to cover those wires. So for the lower section of the walls with the wheel arches, I measured the remaining gap and then cut the correct width. Then used the template, which I kept from stripping the van at the beginning. So if you do have panels, I recommend keeping them until you've done this part because it does make the process a lot easier. And I then repeated for the other side, except this one had added holes for the wiring in my kitchen. After which it was just a case of screwing them in place. Okay, so I want to put this here. There's a bulge, this thing here, which means that obviously that's going to be protruding. But if we continue the bulge, not that one, just some extra spare 12mm, put out there. So yeah, this whole thing will bulge out slightly, but then it means you get a nice uniform. Look at that. I think that'd be better. I then added these strips to finish off the ceiling, and since they're going to be behind the upper cabinet, it doesn't really matter too much how the joints look, but obviously it's nice to make things neat. And to finish off the walls, I just added this last piece, which had to have all the wiring first fed through some holes. This will eventually all be behind a floor-to-ceiling cupboard, which will hide that last join line. And then using some cardboard, I templated the last section of the ceiling around the fan and in the corner. As much as I adored the grain on this plywood, I lightly sanded it down and then got to work painting it. And after 3 coats, it was time to move on to the flooring. I found some vinyl flooring which I really liked, and then I cut it roughly to size just to get it in the van. Then I took it back out so that I could cover all the screws and joints with some duct tape and just put it back in, and then took my time trimming around the wheel arches to make it a nice tight fit. After making some new wheel arch boxes, the vision of the van was starting to become a reality, and it started at last to finally look like the beginnings of a camper van. I actually took it away like this and slept on an air mattress, and it just felt so good, and I was looking forward to finishing the rest of the build. Started to work on my kitchen units by making 4 equally sized rectangles, which I then scribed independently to the wall, making sure to mark which one was which since they all had a slight variation. Oh, and this track I bought for my circular saw is probably the best thing that I bought for the build. It just made such easy work of all the straight cuts, so I highly recommend picking one of these up. Oh. Okay, now that actually works. I didn't film it beforehand because I was just panicking about it going wrong, you know, received such a big piece of wood. But let's show you how I did it for the second piece. I made this template, went a bit wrong, so I extended it a little bit. I kind of just eyeballed it to make sure it was level on that section here, and then I'm going to use the edge of the other piece of wall to basically scribe my first part, and then come back with an actual scribing pen and do the wall part. It worked first time, so fingers crossed if it works again. This was probably one of the most daunting pieces that I cut, just because of how big it was, and if I messed it up that would have meant driving 2 hours to get another sheet of ply. But it all worked out in the end, and once it was cut to shape and fit, I got to work oiling the cupboards, and I also oiled all the kitchen pieces that I've cut so far. So I used an Osmo oil, and I went with the raw effect version because it keeps the colour of the wood that you're applying it to, whereas I found a lot of oil tends to dye the wood slightly yellow or ambery, and I knew I wanted to keep the blonde wood of this poplar. Once I finished with all the oiling, I brought it back into the van and assembled it using wood glue and pocket screws, and I added a few furring strips where I knew that there was wood behind the plywood. Once all that was done, I started with the upper cabinets by first using some offcuts to make the first template, and then I transferred that to the 15mm ply, making sure to mark each one as they all had a different shape. So once both the upper cabinets were assembled, oiled and installed, I got to work on the bed design, which ended up being one of my favourite parts of the build since I'm so stoked of how it turned out. After days, and I mean literal days of working out how to build it, I finally just started it, and like most things that you overthink, it was actually easier than I had feared. So this is obviously the base of the bed, and since it's going to have a part that goes on top which pulls out but also hinges up to reveal the storage, I kept the face on it to maintain the aesthetics of the rest of the build. I just doubled up on the ply on the end pieces and also put this long strip at the front to give the top part a sturdier platform to rest on. The more complicated part of the bed was the top, so I utilised heavy duty drawer runners and prepared the wood to match the width of the runners, and then I started assembling it like this. The main part of this is the internal rectangle, which is the part that slides out, and I added these corner pieces to help the corners maintain a right angle, although I don't think I needed quite that many screws. And then the second part of the design is this U-shaped section, which will be fixed to the wall on a continuous hinge and also holds the bed in place. So I added the 220 kilogram rated draw runners to the outer section first, and then to the inner section, alternating sides one by one, making sure that the runners stayed level by laying it on the flat surface. Next, I cut a sheet the full size of the bed when it was pushed in so that I could then cut it into slats, and this would have been a lot easier with a table saw, but I made do with my circular saw and track. And once they were all cut, it was time to install it, and I used playing cards to space the slats evenly apart. I also used 35mm pin screws, as normal screws would have been probably too thick and likely to split the 15mm ply edge that they were being screwed into. Since my van is only a medium wheelbase, I wanted to save as much space as possible on the inside, but I also wanted a large water tank, so I opted for a 95-litre underslung tank, which I purchased from Bubble Vans as they supply it with all of the holes pre-made and all the fixings needed to mount it onto the vans with this body shape. I also like the fact that they had an easy to follow video, which made the whole process a lot easier and much quicker. I just added a water level gauge so that I could see how much I had in the tank from a display on the inside. And since I'm doing this whole conversion on a driveway, it was an utter nightmare to install just because I didn't have anything to raise the van and it's such a tight space. But with a lot of frustration and grunting from me, I did manage to get there in the end with some blocks and jack just to raise it in place. After that, I started to make the cupboard doors, the drawers and the drawer faces, and finished off the last of the kitchen pieces. And then since I wanted to have a pull-out drawer on the end of my kitchen for my induction cooker, I taped it up and marked the lines which I needed to cut, took the kitchen out of the van, which was pretty awkward, but it did mean that I could use my track saw, as I just didn't trust myself to cut straight enough with the jigsaw alone. And after that, I wanted to hide the metal part around the cab, so I made a little trim to go around there. One of the last big jobs was making the ceiling slats. I did try to get them pre-cut, but it was just far too expensive to do that. So I resorted to putting an edge guide on my circular saw. And while they're not, exactly perfect sizes, it's close enough. I made sure to mark each of the strips because there's a grain pattern in the wood that I wanted to keep when I installed it onto the ceiling. And to install them, I just used 15mm ply as spacers while screwing them in with some 25mm pin screws that I mentioned before, since they're more discreet than the normal screw heads, and I didn't have access to a nail gun. I had to extend 5 pieces, which I did by using pocket hole screws, and then I finished the ceiling with the little pieces behind the fan, and then installed my LED strip lights. Then I made the cutouts for the back and sliding doors by using the original plastic pieces as templates. And I built a step, which I then covered with the same vinyl flooring to fill the gap at the front and to raise the floor for when the swivel seats get installed. And since I wanted to take this van on many longer adventures, I needed to make sure that there was a decent electrical setup. So I got myself a 460 amp hour battery from Fogstar, which fit perfectly in the cupboard since I based the dimensions around the battery at the start. I then made this last unit to fit in between the cupboard and the bed, and I chose to have a drawer at the top and a cupboard at the bottom. And after that, I then finished off all of the drawer faces and the last of the doors. And since the worktop wasn't on yet, I was able to screw in the drawer faces easily from behind. And since I couldn't delay it anymore, I finally got around to installing a diesel heater, and I chose to put it underneath the driver's seat so that it didn't take up any space underneath the bed, just maximising the storage space I had there. And it also means I can tuck away the ducting in the summer months when I don't need it. Next, I added these corner coverings, which can be easily removed with just 2 screws in case I need to change a tail light bulb. And then I started finishing off the kitchen by installing the countertop, which I ordered pre-cut to size since I didn't want to risk making a mess of the laminate by cutting it myself, as apparently it can be quite easy to make chips. And then I installed the sink and tap, added a shower point which can be used with the back doors open or pass through the back window, and finished it off with the plumbing. This is my switch panel, which I housed in the cupboard, and I also added some shelves to the unit. And then I cut down a foam mattress using an electric meat carver, which worked surprisingly well. And while I had my mattress upholstered, I finally got around to installing a single passenger seat with a swivel plate. So if you're thinking, hang on, we're near the end of the video and there's no toilet, well, it was the last job I did since the delivery was quite delayed. And I planned on having a futon style box which could be moved around the van and used as an extra seat or footrest, so I got to work making a box for it. When I finished designing that toilet box, I brought it into the van, and I just wasn't that keen on how much space it took, and while I think you need a toilet, I just wasn't very happy with this one. So while I have kept that for now, I'm actually currently experimenting with a portable pop-up option, which I've got to say I actually prefer, purely because it means I get to keep this more open. And so that is it, that is my Scandi-inspired camper van. I'm currently enjoying it in Scotland. It's rather cold right now, but I'm getting to enjoy all the snow-capped mountains. I hope you enjoyed the build process as much as I enjoyed building it. And I've got some adventures planned, so consider subscribing if you're not already. Give this video a like, leave a little comment, let me know what you think, and I shall see you in the next one. Cheers.